Alright, so in this video I'm going to show you guys how to install a star nut. It goes into the steer tube. Here's our fork. This fork's a little bit taken apart. We are missing an outer leg here. It's called the lower. Then we got the stanchion. We got the steer tube. This part right here in the middle, that's our crown. And then actually we got part of the headset on here, which is this piece of metal right here. This is the crown race. So this is separate. This is what the lower bearing will be riding on. So this is part of the headset. So if you get a new headset, this is part of it right here. This goes on. This actually gets smacked down. There's a special tool that's going to smack this down, probably another 5 millimeters or so, held on with friction, and then the bearings will be installed, and then this will be installed back onto the bike. But anyways, so what happens if you get a fork you just bought off somebody? It was used, it's been cut down before, but there's still, it's still a long steer tube, and you need to go ahead and measure it to your bike. You're going to cut off your excess, so you just cut some more off, and you actually cut the old star nut out as well. Or maybe it's kind of in the way where you just can knock it down, so it's okay to keep that star nut in there. That original star nut, you could pound it down out of the way, or in this case, like this one, there was existing star nut here. I came in with a new one, pounded everything down, so this first star nut is actually probably sitting right underneath the other one. No big deal, it's just a little added weight if you care about that. But overall, it's fine. There is a hole in the bottom if you chose to knock it down all the way, but that's a long ways to go. That star nut is grabbing and kind of taking some metal, scratching the interior. Not a huge deal, but overall you can just leave that second star nut in there. Not a big deal, it's not gonna hurt anything. We got a star nut on the inside. I'll show you how to insert this one. I am gonna be using the old style. What are they calling this? This is a Park Tool TNS-1. It'll do 1 inch and 1.1 inch steer tube. So I'm using my repair stand to hold my fork right now. And then once we come back over here, and this basically sits right on top just like that, but it doesn't quite want to fit right. So that's where you have to pound it, but it has a tendency to want to shift left or shift right. So there's the shape of our star nut. So that's right side up, that's correct. And then we can actually go upside down, which we don't want. We want the shape to be going upward, like the fins of an arrow. So imagine this driving down, that's what we want. It's almost kind of like a barbed hook. So once we drive this down, it's going to be very hard for this to pull back up. Basically, this star nut is becoming one with the steer tube, which will allow our top nut cap to come in, screw into this. It's going to grab this and start pulling up, which is now attached to our steer tube and the whole fork. So the whole fork is going to be moving up as one unit. That's how we take all the play out of our headset. So I'm going to screw this on just like that. And this sits right up here, and you can see this is kind of just squirrely. Even if I try to push down by hand, it's not going to go in. So I'm going to try and smack it with the hammer and make sure the alignment is always nice and straight. So typically I would be holding this fork in my hand, and I would try to be doing all this in one shot. I'd be holding the steer tube here. I would be holding the tool with the star nut. So one hand's holding steer tube, the other one's guiding the actual steer tool, and then I come with a hammer and smack it. So I don't want to put this on the ground because the bottom of the fork, the dropouts, we don't want those to get bent. The bottom of the forks, a lot of them have rebound buttons, air caps, things like that. We don't want to harm that area, so that's why I'm holding it up in the air and then doing all this in the air. So if you give it 1 or 2 good smacks, you have to be real careful though that you don't pinch your finger in the process. So that's one method. This method I'm doing with the repair stand. If you're going to do this, make sure you have it nice and tight because you don't want the whole fork to slip out and fall and hit the floor. So if you got a buddy to help you, or you can maybe use the end of a vise, where you could sit this on the end of the vise right underneath the crown race, and then you can go from there. But here I'm just going to proceed with caution. I'm going to tighten this up, and then got my hammer set ready to go. So basically this always has to be in a nice straight up and down direction, and put that as straight as you can. If you give it one firm whack, it might shock it enough where it can get stuck in there, and if it's slightly crooked, that's okay. And just make sure your steer tube isn't sliding out of your repair stand. So right there, it got a little stuck and then it came loose. Let me give it another whack. So right there, it's a little crooked, so I'm using my wrist to, you're doing a visual, using your wrist to straighten it up, using counter force not too hard to where it wants to pop out. Give it another smack. So it's lodged in there pretty good, but it is over to the side just a little bit. So with my hand, I'm gonna apply gentle pressure, bringing it back to the center. As I'm tapping it, and I'll be able to steer it back to where it needs to be. As you go deeper, it's gonna wanna start centering itself as well, so it will start to help you. So definitely are a little bit crooked, but we're just barely started, enough to hold this guy in place. I can give it just a gentle wiggle, it stays in place. And then if I get my ruler here, put it in line with my steer tube, this guy right here. And then you can kind of see how this is over to this side over here. So it needs to go back this direction. So you could use the ruler as a guide, or you could just use your eyeball. It's not too difficult once we get it driven in a little deeper. So another option, if you have something stationary and firm that's pretty tough, if you have a vise grate, if you have a workbench, you can utilize that. So here's my crown race. Right underneath, it's hollow underneath here. So I'm gonna use the tip, which is the handle. I'm gonna have that sit just like that. So now this is holding it for me. This would be the second person if they were helping you, and you can go ahead and start smacking, go from there. So that's another alternative. So the other alternative, I guess you can call it a little bit more advanced, but where you're holding the steer tube, the whole fork, and then you're guiding the whole tool at the same time while you're smacking it. This is way we're not putting it on the table and smacking and accidentally doing some damage to our dropout feet right here, or any other type of buttons or levers. So I'm going to be using my thumb in my hand, basically putting some pressure on this guy, trying to straighten it up. Of course, your fingers right here, it could get caught, could get pinched, so always be aware of that. So I'm just using my thumb, putting pressure that way as I'm smacking it. And it's starting to get a little straighter. We're getting a little bit deeper. Watch your fingers, you're not going to get pinched right in here, because we're going to drive this. This will set it to the perfect depth. We're going to go down probably another ½ inch or so, and just going to drive it all the way till there's nothing left. So I'm coming over here to the repair stand just so I can finish this off. So what's cool about this tool, it does have this gap right here. So it's going to be pretty much self-setting. The more I drive it down, this is going to come to this end, is going to hit the top base of our steer tube, and it's going to stop perfectly. So it's going to set it to the perfect depth. It does have to be down, recessed in at a certain distance. So I'm going to tighten my clamp up really good. And if I need to do a little more manipulating, put some pressure to keep this guy straight. And we're getting closer. So then you want to check this area right here where the two meet. Basically we call that the seam. Look all the way around, making sure you're nice and flush. If one side has a little bit of a gap, you can apply pressure to where that gap is. Go ahead and give it a hit. You could even kind of angle the hammer as you're coming down. And then at a certain point, everything's going to touch. So a little bit of a gap over on this side. So there's a little bit of a gap right over here. Very thin. The tip of my pick really doesn't even fit in there. Over on this side is pretty flush, nice and tight. So you can go ahead and try and put some pressure on your tool this direction as you're hitting the hammer. And if it goes flat, great. If not, not a big deal, because sometimes when the steer tube was cut, usually these are cut by hand, sometimes this is not a nice and flat flush cut. So the cut could be slightly off, so you're always going to end up with a little bit of a gap. This is totally okay. There still should be plenty of room to get your screw nice and straight in the threads. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to apply pressure this direction, see if I can close up that gap a little bit. And then of course make sure your tool is still tight, because it unscrews. You can see that as it unscrews, it creates a gap. So I'm going to screw all the way down, and it's just finger tight, boom, just like that. So everything looks good. I'm pretty satisfied with that. Again, if you have a slight gap somewhere that's not going away, you're probably still going to be okay for alignment. It's just that your steer tube, when it got cut by hand, it didn't get cut properly or straight. So now we can go ahead and unscrew this guy. And then we're done. So there is this different style. There's a newer style that has a sliding sleeve. It has a grip that slides down. When that sleeve comes down, it actually comes over your steer tube. And so it helps with the whole alignment. So you don't have to use your hand and try and do this and accidentally get your finger or your palm pinched as you're smacking it down. So the newer style, I'll get that number for you, the part number. That might be just easier to use. It's still using a hammer to pound on top, but it helps with the alignment a whole lot. This is just like real heavy solid metal, which is kind of cool.